Vanessa?
Thank you, Bobby. Good morning, good afternoon. Pleased to be presenting today on what is really just a hot button topic that is impacting so many manufacturing companies globally right now. Next slide, please. Going to be covering some background just to walk through a few examples of recent supply shortages to show the audience how diverse the impacts are that can impact supply chains, particularly in this global environment that we're living in. The outlook for the supply chain, I'll ruin the ending, it's not great, and companies are needing to become more resilient and needing to adapt to these growing and ever increasing stressors on lengthy supply chains. A couple of trends that we are tracking with respect to case law, and then finally some lessons learned and some key takeaways. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, so one item that I would be remiss not to walk through is the microchip, the semiconductor shortage, and how it impacted automotive. I'm based in Detroit, so I work with a lot of automotive clients as well as other manufacturers, and the automotive industry was hit hard by this issue. Just to walk through with the group what happened. First, there was the 12-week shutdown that impacted most manufacturers, including vehicle manufacturers. The OEMs dramatically slashed their orders, and that in turn caused the tier one suppliers that source the chips from predominantly from one location. 54% of chips globally are sourced from TSMC, Taiwan, and a very small percentage of that actually ends up in vehicles. They're only 2 to 3% of TSMC's total business, so just a real tiny sliver. And we had the vehicle manufacturers slashing their order, the tier one slashing their order, and in turn, the chip vendors filled their orders elsewhere. There was a massive uptick in the need for electronic devices with everyone working from home. So there were a number of orders that were filled, and TSMC was operating at its max capacity as of Q1, Q2 2020. Skip forward to the third quarter, the second half of last year, and suddenly there was such an increase in demand for vehicles that no one anticipated. People had their stimulus checks and were shopping for vehicles again. So that caused an uptick in the orders from the tier ones needing to increase their orders to the chip vendors. And at that point in time, they were already maxed out. There was nowhere else to fill those chip orders. Looking at earlier this year, we saw car plants shutting down. To make matters worse, regular type of force majeure events started happening. Earthquakes, the Texas storms. There was a drought in Taiwan that even threatened TSMC's production. A fire in Renesas, one of the largest manufacturers of chips in Japan. And then the Suez Canal blockage, as well as ongoing shipping and container issues that I know many of you are facing currently. From about the mid point of this year through the end of this year, it really is at its peak. And unfortunately, we expect it to continue to have issues into 2022 with respect to the microchips. I mentioned here the toilet paper phenomenon, which is artificially inflated demand that prolongs the shortage. We all saw that at the beginning of COVID. And what happened here in automotive is OEMs understand that suppliers have an obligation to reasonably allocate available supply. So what the OEMs did, which made the situation worse, is they just increased their orders. Instead of ordering 100% of their needs for components and causing the tier ones to try and fill those orders, they ordered 300%. So they artificially inflated the issue, and now everyone in automotive is scrambling to figure out how to fill these orders, which orders are real, and how to allocate available supply. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk through a few other areas of shortages and just show you how diverse the issues can be that impact supply chains. Lumber, I know anyone that's been to Home Depot or working on a home improvement project right now knows that those prices have skyrocketed. They're 7 times where they were last year. And it's going to take about 6 to 12 months for the lumber production to catch up to the demand. Metals. such a critically important area with everything going on with batteries and electrification. These precious metals really come from 3 locations, and the demand has increased more than ever before. And to mine for these metals, it takes an average of 16 years from the discovery of the deposit. So we're talking about a massive, lengthy amount of time for product that's going to be needed, that the demand is at an all-time high. Steel and resins, very similar to what happened with lumber. Everyone expected a slump in automobiles. There was never issue sourcing resin before, and now it's a massive issue, and it's impacting the raw material inputs for resins. Poultry, this is an interesting one. People are eating a lot more fried chicken, specifically during the pandemic, and there has been supply chains can't keep up, and a number of restaurants have had to completely remove chicken wings and chicken fingers from their menus because they can't source it. Chlorine. This is a really unique example, and I wanted to add it because it shows that you just can't predict what the next force majeure event is going to be. The reason chlorine supplies are running low is not because people went out and put pools in, although I know some people did during the pandemic because they were spending more time at home in their backyards, but that there was a fire at a plant in Louisiana where a very large amount of the US supply of chlorine tablets comes from. And that caused the plant to shut down, and folks had to source elsewhere for their chlorine. Gasoline. This is not due to a gas shortage. The gasoline issue is due to the fact that about 25% of tanker trucks right now are parked because there's a labor shortage. They can't find drivers. At the beginning of COVID, a number of drivers just retired, and there just they haven't been able to fill and train the tanker drivers. And then ketchup packets. I found this one interesting, with the CDC discouraging the dine-in and community condiments. There has been a massive uptick in the need for ketchup packets. So much so that Heinz had to produce 25% more last year, which represents 12 billion ketchup packets. Next slide, please. Next slide. So there's a lot of examples and a wide array of impacts that can have ripple effects across supply chains. Everything from workforce issues, raw material inputs, environmental issues, geopolitical issues, traditional force majeure events, etc. So COVID-19 really did become the perfect stress test for supply chains. And some companies were able to pivot and adapt, and others struggled and had to come up with a contingency plan. Will this improve? That's what I think a lot of folks are asking. And the answer is, I think supply chains will remain incredibly sensitive for a couple of reasons, a few reasons. First, there's just the globalization of supply chains. We're no longer sourcing things from the same state where perhaps the manufacturing or assembly is being done or the sales being made. Things are coming from all over the globe. And that, of course, is going to be a longer lead time, a longer supply chain is more sensitive. Then there's the electrification of everything. The number of batteries, lithium considerations, and other things that are going to be playing out in the future, particularly with respect to, if you just think about the number of electronic devices that you had 10 years ago versus now, everything is becoming electrified, and that is going to further stress supply chains. Labor shortages and freight issues all are going to continue given the nature of globalization, electrification, and the current state of supply chains. That contrasted with the traditional mentality of this just-in-time lean manufacturing model, where you sole source all your volumes from one supplier, is causing an incredible amount of tension. Next slide. So this became an opportunity for manufacturers to really examine their supply chains. And many manufacturers already had a major focus on this from the tariffs in 2018. And we're looking at supply chain mapping exercises, considering nearshoring, reshoring as a result of some of the fallout from tariffs and the trade wars. But again, the last 18 months have even further heightened the importance of looking at your supply chain, having resiliency and transparency. We heard time and time again from customers, what was the best thing that your supply base could do to help you? And it was providing transparency. Most suppliers understand, most manufacturers understand what's going on one level below their immediate suppliers, but not below that. And having transparency into other levels of your sub-suppliers and their supply chain is critically important. Having contingency plans in place. And then I add here, never waste a good crisis. Even though it's been painful, I think that companies have learned and adapted, and we're going to talk about some of the things that we're seeing. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so a couple of case law trends that we're tracking, and I will tell you, before the pandemic, most case law on force majeure was from not the turn of the last century, but the turn of the century before. It was like horse and carriage case law that was so antiquated, and the reason is, the reason that it's not common to see cases about force majeure is simply that a lot of these things are worked out at the procurement level, at the sales level, at the commercial negotiation table, and not something that you rush to court suing your customer or your supplier. So that's why I don't think there's been a lot of recent case law on it. But we are starting to see an uptick in case law. So the number one question that everyone was asking at the beginning of last year is, well, is this really a force majeure event? Does it qualify? Now, force majeure is a creature of contract, meaning that your force majeure provision is either found in the written contract or you don't have a force majeure argument. You do have a commercial impracticability argument, which arises under the UCC section 2-615, and that applies to all sales of goods. So sometimes where something is not expressly force majeure because it's not in the contract, you still have the defense that it was commercially impracticable because of circumstances, unforeseeable circumstances beyond a party's control. What we are finding is that most courts are interpreting the pandemic, COVID, as a natural disaster and the shutdowns and related executive orders as government action. Other courts are more broadly construing some of these force majeure provisions, particularly where they contain that catch-all language that so many companies just cut and paste into all of their commercial contracts, whether or not they're on the buy side or the sell side, which is to list all the terrible things that could befall, and then to say, or any other circumstances beyond a party's reasonable control. That's a lot. You can get a lot into that. That's a broad catch-all. So while not every court will construe that the event was a triggering event under a force majeure provision, unless it was drafted pretty narrowly, most courts likely will. And the question really isn't just, is it a force majeure event, but did it prevent performance? And that's the two-step analysis that needs to be done. Sometimes there will be a force majeure qualifying event, but the party can still perform. And that was not the case in the JN Contemporary case, in which we saw an auction that could not take place because of the New York executive order shutdown. A judge said, no, this is absolutely force majeure. You're excused from performing during the duration of the force majeure event. Next slide. Case law trend number 2. We've seen a few brave manufacturers that rush to court trying to seek injunctive relief. Very difficult to obtain injunctive relief. Much more difficult when courts are actually finding that it would be impossible to perform under the contract, as was a situation in these two cases where the performance was prevented. Interestingly, in the NXP case, there was a fight about whether or not there was a battle of the forms. There was a battle of the forms fight about whether or not the contract had a force majeure provision and whether NXP could rely on that force majeure provision. The court said it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. With what's going on globally, with all these shipping issues, the unavailability of chips, impossible to make more at the time frame needed, the court found it commercially impracticable and denied the injunction on that ground. Next slide, please. Next slide. So some strategies for mitigating risk. What can companies do? What are we seeing companies do? Having a built-in warning system, there's always going to be a balance between, you can't make, not everything can be dual sourced. Not everything can be, you can't have safety stock for all components. But looking at a balance, what did cause a shutdown in my assembly line? Where could we build a safety net, and how do we do that? Having more visibility into suppliers and their sub-suppliers to understand early on if a supply chain issue is occurring, to be able business-to-business integration with data sharing across platforms, critically important for companies that want to have an early contingency plan in place, and then really leveraging technology. Next slide. So what we hear always from clients, and this is true, is that it's cost is king. The price is going to be critically important, and that's what drives most sourcing decisions. However, to save a penny on a piece price, but then end up with a line down that costs hundreds of thousands or more, depending on the industry, it might be better to have a contingency plan in place if the company can. If this is not a sole source, specially manufactured product, if instead it is something that you can dual source. For example, the semiconductors, the microchips, those absolutely could have been sourced. We know that they can be held for a certain period of time in inventory. And this is a crisis that shouldn't have occurred, but it is. Also looking at having multiple sources and multiple locations. It just makes it easier to pivot if there is a major force majeure event impacting one country or area. For example, the power outages in China and the power rationing that we're seeing impact Chinese suppliers right now. Having it diversified such that you have one supplier in China and one supplier in perhaps Mexico or somewhere else. Inventory safeguards. Yes, it's expensive to stock inventory, but it's critically important to maintaining continuity of supply. And companies that did have safety stock on site or even off site for other force majeure issues were able to continue operating at least longer than those that didn't. Next slide. So what should be done? Take a fresh look at commercial contracts. Contracts are what govern risk and how the parties allocate risk under the contract. Things that we're seeing right now that parties are sending letters back and forth about are things like the labor shortages and just how difficult it is to keep lines running. Increased freight costs that are well beyond what anyone ever anticipated at the time they entered into the contract, were not part of the manufacturer's cost walk and now have just caused an amazing burden and impacted profitability. So looking at those things, deciding how to allocate going forward, taking advantage of opportunities to try and renegotiate long-term agreements with strategic suppliers and customers, taking into account those issues. I expect to see a lot more indexing, price indexing for things like raw materials and freight in future contracts. Next slide. Some red flag provisions that could be looked at across contracts, and one, of course, in particular, force majeure. I think that we've talked more about force majeure than ever before in the last 18 months. I've always said it was critically important. You should not have the same buy side and sell side force majeure provisions because they're really at odds with each other depending which side you're on as the buyer or the seller. Next slide. And then investing in cybersecurity is just going to be so important because of all of the increased data that companies are sharing and making sure that that data is protected due to the risks of increased cyber attacks and hacking that we're seeing, really training employees on how to recognize those issues and those threats. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so here's the key lessons learned. I'm just going to wrap this up. Look at your contracts with an eye towards provisions that will impact your rights in the event of a shortage. Look at what actually happened and learn from those issues. Working closely with sales and procurement because those are the folks on the ground that are dealing with these issues. If possible, have a backup supplier, have a dual source, or have a backup supplier on deck and qualified. And then training employees on important things like cybersecurity, procurement, what certain key terms and contracts actually mean so that they understand what the risk they're signing up for. All right. Thank you everyone for your time.